In the last decade, Africa has witnessed an exponential rise in digital connectivity, a transformation that has had profound implications for civic engagement, economic development, and the exercise of democratic rights. However, alongside these gains, a disturbing counter-trend has emerged: the strategic use of internet shutdowns by governments to control information, suppress dissent, and protect regime interests. Since 2016, documented internet shutdowns in Africa have more than doubled, with over 190 incidents recorded across at least 41 countries by 2024, including particularly egregious episodes in Ethiopia, Sudan, and Algeria. These shutdowns, often deployed during protests, elections, and political crises, have become emblematic of digital authoritarianism on the continent, posing serious threats to civil liberties, freedom of expression, and the integrity of democratic governance. This report provides an in-depth exploration of the phenomenon of internet shutdowns in Africa, drawing on statistical evidence, legal analysis, and vivid case studies to illuminate the implications for digital rights and democracy. It charts the rise of these shutdowns, scrutinizes governmental motivations, analyzes the impact on society, and assesses ongoing resistance and policy responses. Historical context: mapping the surge in internet shutdowns. The history of internet shutdowns in Africa traces back to isolated incidents, but such practices became regularized after the Arab Spring in 2011, when regimes in Egypt and neighboring states cut nationwide access to stifle protest movements. Nevertheless, the trend accelerated markedly from 2016 onward. New research reveals that the number of government-mandated shutdowns on the continent doubled from 14 in 2016 to 28 in 2024, affecting all regions and social classes. According to the African Digital Rights Network, between 2016 and 2024, there were over 190 incidents of internet shutdowns across 41 African countries. Ethiopia leads this grim tally with 30 shutdowns, followed by Sudan with 21, and Algeria with 14. Notably, since 2018, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Algeria have each imposed shutdowns at least once every year, signaling the normalization of this repressive tool. Shutdowns manifest as nationwide blackouts, regional outages, social media blocks, or throttling of bandwidth, disrupting the ability of millions to communicate, access essential services, conduct commerce, or participate in political debate. The triggers for these shutdowns have evolved over time. While the first wave often coincided with mass protests, as in Guinea in 2007 and Egypt in 2011, the latter years saw shutdowns regularly imposed around elections, during national examinations, and in response to perceived threats to regime stability. For example, in 2024 alone, 21 shutdowns were recorded in 15 African countries, the largest annual number since records began. With the most common justifications being protests and election-related tensions. Internet shutdowns during protests, silencing dissent. Governments across Africa have shown a pronounced inclination to deploy internet shutdowns as a tool for quelling protests and suppressing dissent. These blackouts are frequently timed to coincide with mass demonstrations or moments of social unrest, under the pretext of maintaining public order or national security. The underlying rationale is clear. By constraining citizens' ability to coordinate or broadcast abuses, authorities weaken mobilization, obscure state violence, and undermine accountability. For example, in Sudan, security forces repeatedly shut down the internet during waves of civil resistance, most dramatically during the 2019 uprising and the October 2021 military coup. A complete shutdown, lasting 25 days in 2021, left millions unable to access banking or emergency services. Activists have documented that shutdowns during protests enable crackdowns, with security forces acting with impunity in the absence of scrutiny. Amnesty International has reported that such blackouts have left medical workers unable to coordinate aid and families unable to check on relatives amidst violence. Similarly, research shows that shutdowns imposed during protest movements in Nigeria, #EndSARS, Eswatini, and Cameroon have thrown entire regions into social and economic paralysis. Statistical evidence underscores the pattern. In 2024, protests accounted for the majority of Africa's 21 shutdowns, with authorities in 9 countries, including Kenya, Mozambique, and Burundi, imposing internet restrictions in response to demonstrations. Internet shutdowns during elections, undermining democratic integrity. Elections are a flashpoint for internet shutdowns across Africa. Authorities frequently justify such measures as necessary to prevent the spread of disinformation, incitement, or unrest. Yet the real effect is often to undermine transparency and electoral integrity. In 6 out of 14 African elections in 2021, internet restrictions or blackout measures were imposed, following a trend established by a surge of shutdowns in 2016, when 5 countries, including Uganda, Gabon, and Congo-Brazzaville, resorted to this tactic during competitive elections. Shutdowns take several forms during elections: blocking social media, throttling internet speeds, or executing total blackouts on election day or during vote counting periods. For instance, during Uganda's 2021 election, the government shut down the entire internet, with disruptions selectively targeting social media beforehand, a practice also seen in Togo, Burundi, and Tanzania. Authorities typically claim such actions protect the process from manipulation or unrest. Yet credible observers, including the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, ACHPR, have repeatedly highlighted the threat these measures pose to free and fair elections by impeding citizen oversight, election observation, and media coverage. A clear illustration occurred in Zambia's 2021 general elections, when the government blocked key social media platforms during voting and tallying, an act widely perceived as designed to manipulate public perception and restrict opposition communication. Despite the blackout, the opposition scored a historic victory, suggesting that such tactics may sometimes spur even greater civic engagement in adversity, though at the cost of transparency and trust. Shutdowns as a mechanism of control, government rationales and motivations. Despite diverse public arguments, the core governmental rationale for internet shutdowns is the exertion of control. Control over the narrative, information flows, and the collective action capacity of citizens. Research reveals that shutdowns are overwhelmingly ordered by the executive branch and overwhelmingly implemented by private actors, telecom providers and ISPs, due to regulatory compulsion or legal obligation. Common justifications fall into 3 overlapping categories. National security and public order. Shutdowns are framed as emergency measures to stop incitement, hatred, or the organization of violence, typically a pretext during protests or ethnic conflict. 2. Protecting electoral integrity. Authorities claim that blackouts prevent the dissemination of false results, rumors, or fake news, and thus safeguard peaceful polls. 3. Preventing examination cheating. Especially in Algeria and Ethiopia, internet restrictions during national examinations are justified as a means to curb leaks and cheating. However, human rights organizations contend that these justifications rarely withstand scrutiny, as blanket shutdowns are neither necessary nor proportionate and routinely harm fundamental rights. Studies further show that authoritarian regimes and long-standing rulers are disproportionately responsible. Between 2015 and 2019, 77% of African countries that enacted internet shutdowns were classified as authoritarian, and 79% of leaders in office for over 13 years had ordered at least one shutdown. Moreover, the resort to exam-related shutdowns has normalized the tactic and paved the way for its application to overtly repressive ends, further eroding norms of openness, legal and policy frameworks, enabling and challenging shutdowns. Legal regimes governing internet shutdowns in Africa are complex and fragmented. In nearly 30 countries, national laws empower either the executive or telecommunications regulators to order the suspension of internet services in the name of national security or public order. These laws are typically vague, overly broad, and lack meaningful judicial or parliamentary oversight. African and international human rights law provide clear protections for freedom of expression, access to information, and political participation. According to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, as well as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, limitations on rights must be prescribed by law, serve a legitimate aim, and be necessary and proportionate. Blanket shutdowns almost never meet these criteria. The ACHPR has responded with repeated resolutions, most recently in March 2024, unequivocally condemning network disruptions before, during, and after elections, and calling on states to refrain from ordering or enabling such restrictive measures. These resolutions reaffirm that internet access is essential for realizing civil and political rights, and urge both states and telecom companies to uphold their obligations. Furthermore, regional courts have begun to rule on the issue. The ECOWAS court found in the 2020 case over Togo's 2017 shutdown that access to the internet is a derivative right essential to freedom of expression, awarding damages to petitioners and ordering future non-repetition. The role of telecom providers and ISPs, a crucial but sometimes overlooked actor in the architecture of shutdowns, is the private telecommunications sector. Network operators and ISPs are frequently compelled, under threat of license suspension or legal sanction, to implement state-ordered disruptions, even if these orders violate human rights standards. In some cases, these companies have quietly attempted to push back or delay compliance. But the overwhelming trend is rapid acquiescence, sometimes without public disclosure or transparency. For instance, during the 2019 Sudan shutdown, Zain Sudan complied with the blackout directive until a court order compelled the restoration of services. In Uganda's 2021 election, and Egypt's 2011 shutdown, multiple operators complied with governmental directives. In Ethiopia, the existence of a state monopoly via Ethio Telecom obviates any meaningful resistance. Digital rights advocates point to the complicity of telecoms in facilitating shutdowns and have called on these enterprises to comply with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and resist unlawful orders when possible. Human and socio-economic impact. The consequences of internet shutdowns in Africa extend far beyond the mere inconvenience of a temporarily disconnected population. Every blackout has a material and psychological cost, denying citizens the ability to communicate, organize, or call for help in times of crisis. Shutdowns impede access to vital services such as healthcare, education, online payments, and emergency aid, especially as more Africans rely on digital platforms for daily life, business, and civil engagement. Economic toll. Internet disruptions have cost the region billions. In sub-Saharan Africa, shutdowns between 2015 and 2017 resulted in losses of up to $237 million. In the first months of 2019 alone, economic losses were $267 million, with Sudan losing at least $7.5 million per day during major shutdowns. Cameroon's 2017 regional whiteout resulted in $5 million in lost revenues for tech startups and service workers. Across Africa, regional e-commerce and mobile-driven economies saw estimated losses of $3.9 billion between 2020 and 2023. This table demonstrates the devastating financial impact of even short-lived shutdowns, often hurting small businesses, fintech, and rural consumers the most. Civil and political rights. Shutdowns interfere with virtually every fundamental right, most directly, freedom of expression, access to information, assembly, and political participation. Journalists, civil society, opposition politicians, and vulnerable groups are especially impacted, as they lose not only their megaphone, but also critical networks of support and information. In the context of armed conflict, shutdowns facilitate impunity for government abuses by concealing evidence and disrupting documentation efforts. In Sudan, shutdowns during conflict or coups have hampered humanitarian relief, leaving millions cut off from food, medicine, and aid transfers. Emergency coordination efforts, dependent on online communications, were entirely paralyzed in parts of Khartoum in February 2024, risking countless lives. Widening the digital divide. Africa already faces vast urban-rural and gender gaps in digital access. Each shutdown entrenches digital poverty, deepening existing social divides, and undermining the AU's 2030 vision for a digitally empowered citizenry. The economic and human cost is, in the words of one Kenyan activist, like they want to erase us. Deep dives, country case studies. Ethiopia, the arsenal of internet blackouts. No country exemplifies the normalization of internet shutdowns more than Ethiopia. Since 2016, Ethiopia has imposed at least 30 shutdowns, with interruptions now a routine response to both national protests and local conflict. The most infamous episode occurred during the Tigray conflict from November 2020 until mid-2022, when authorities imposed an almost complete digital blackout on the entire region for over 18 months. This not only crippled humanitarian coordination and news reporting, but also created a near-total information vacuum amid reports of war crimes and atrocities. Ethiopia has also imposed repeated short-term shutdowns during national exams to prevent cheating, a tactic that became normalized from 2016 forward and has served as political cover for more repressive uses during protests or regional unrest. The cost is severe. Every day of national outage is estimated to cost $3.5 million in lost GDP, Even as parts of the Tigray region have regained connectivity, other areas remain subject to on-off blackouts due to continuing security operations, and the threat of shutdown always looms in periods of heightened tension. Sudan, from protests to war, weaponizing connectivity, is the second most frequent offender, with 21 shutdowns documented since 2016. The strategic use of shutdowns peaked during moments of political upheaval, such as the 2019 uprising against President al-Bashir, the 2021 military coup, and the ongoing civil war that erupted in April 2023. During these crises, internet and communication networks were not only blacked out in the capital, but also deliberately shut in conflict-ridden Darfur, compounding humanitarian suffering and isolating millions. Shutting down the internet during waves of protests became almost reflexive. The October 2021 coup was accompanied by a 25-day total blackout, effectively paralyzing opposition organization. In the ongoing conflict, both the Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF, and the Rapid Support Forces, RSF, have repeatedly disconnected regions under enemy control, using digital darkness as a tool of war. Humanitarian organizations have documented the crippling effect. Inability to wire remittances, order medicines, coordinate evacuations, or reach loved ones. During the February 2024 blackout alone, nearly 30 million Sudanese were left without any digital means to survive amid war, with ERRs, emergency response rooms, rendered inoperative. Algeria, normalizing exam blackouts and selective censorship. Algeria's shutdowns, while less frequent than those in Ethiopia or Sudan, are unique for their systematic deployment during school exams. Since a scandal in 2016, nationwide blackouts or extensive throttling have been imposed annually during the week of baccalaureate exams, with 2 daily outages coinciding with exam sessions. While authorities claim this is necessary to prevent leaks, the disruptions affect businesses, media, and daily life, and cost hundreds of millions of dollars in lost GDP each year. Algeria's approach evolved from complete internet outages 2016 to 2019 to more targeted throttling and platform blocking in subsequent years. But even these measures essentially shutter most online services due to the dominant mode of internet access via mobile. The economic and social disruption has triggered calls from civil society to end this collective punishment. Yet the tactic persists, contributing to the dangerous normalization of state-imposed digital blackouts in non-crisis contexts. Comparative analysis beyond the worst offenders. While Ethiopia, Sudan, and Algeria stand out, internet shutdowns have been imposed in at least 41 African countries since 2016, including Nigeria, Cameroon, Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, Benin, and Eswatini. Non-state actors, such as militias, have occasionally played a role in disconnecting communications. In Uganda, for example, a 7-month ban of Facebook, Meta, implemented in 2021, a response to criticism and election-related challenges, remains in effect as of 2025, despite ongoing negotiations. Regional patterns emerge. Shutdowns are most frequent in states with strong autocratic tendencies, long-ruling leaders, or ongoing civil strife. New offenders such as Comoros, Guinea-Bissau, and Mauritius joined the ranks in 2024, with first-time shutdowns demonstrating the risk of broader normalization. Even where blackouts are not ultimately executed, their threat shapes electoral environments and limits civic space by fostering fear and uncertainty. Resistance, circumvention, and digital activism. Civil society organizations, international NGOs, and regional institutions have fought to contest, expose, and limit shutdowns across the continent. Campaigns such as Keep It On, launched by Access Now, monitor and document incidents, provide circumvention tools, and support legal action against abusive shutdowns. Cases brought before regional human rights courts have begun to establish important precedents for the right to internet access as integral to freedom of expression and information. Technological circumvention is increasingly common. The search for VPNs rose dramatically in blackout-prone countries such as Ethiopia and Senegal. Ethiopia's VPN search demand increased by more than 3,600% in 2023 alone. Likewise, protesters and civil society groups rely on mesh networks, satellite links, and decentralized messaging platforms to maintain communications during outages. However, full nationwide blackouts remain difficult to circumvent, leaving millions effectively silenced. The global context: Africa's place in the shutdown epidemic. While Africa is the primary focus of this report, the continent's experience reflects a global trend toward digital repression. According to Access Now, 2024 marked a record for global internet shutdowns, with 296 incidents in 54 countries worldwide. Africa accounted for nearly 20% of all shutdowns, disproportionately affecting the youngest, most connected populations. Globally, only India and a handful of other states surpass Africa's top offenders in the frequency and duration of blackouts. Shutdowns are increasingly discussed in the language of digital sovereignty, with governments citing US-based tech firms' reluctance to moderate harmful content as justification for blocking platforms or access. Nevertheless, both national courts and regional human rights bodies have begun to recognize that the open internet is a prerequisite for democratic legitimacy and socio-economic development, setting legal limits on its arbitrary suspension. Conclusions and recommendations. Safeguarding Africa's digital future. The growing epidemic of internet shutdowns in Africa is a direct threat to civil liberties, democratic governance, and socio-economic progress. While the stated aims of shutdowns, such as preserving security, electoral integrity, or educational fairness, may sound legitimate, their real-world effect is wholesale collective punishment, deepening digital divides, and undermining trust in political institutions. As one global expert observes, when the internet goes dark, it's not just screens that go blank. It's people's voices. It's accountability. It's democracy itself. Several concrete steps are crucial if the continent is to reverse the normalization of this repressive tactic. Robust legal reform. Countries should align their communications laws with regional and international human rights standards, ensuring that any restrictions on digital access are strictly necessary, proportionate, lawful, and subject to judicial review. Telecom accountability. Telecom providers and ISPs must be transparent about government shutdown orders and should resist unlawful directives where possible, upholding international business and human rights norms. Regional and international advocacy. The ACHPR and other regional bodies must continue to hold states accountable, investigate abuses, and solidify legal standards. Meanwhile, international pressure remains vital, both to deter abuses and spur reform, or civil society mobilization and digital resilience. Support for civil society, digital rights advocacy, and technological circumvention tools is essential to empower citizens, document abuses, and maintain alternative channels of communication during shutdowns. All subsection. End paragraph. Inclusive digital development. African governments must view connectivity as a public good fundamental to economic and democratic development, not as a lever of political control. The AU Digital Transformation Strategy and SDGs provide a blueprint for this vision. As the continent moves deeper into the digital age, the stakes will only increase. The battle over internet shutdowns, whether won or lost, will shape not just Africa's digital rights, but the future of its democracy, economy, and civic life for generations to come.